She sat on the sidewalk surrounded by sketches of hope, portraits of strangers she might never see again, painted with hands that trembled from chemo. 16-year-old Ella didn't expect sympathy. She only needed enough for the next round of treatment. Then a man in a hoodie bought everything, without a word. The next morning, the internet exploded. But behind the clickbait headline was a secret connection, a past neither of them saw coming, and a decision that would tear the world apart or bring it together. What if the person who saved your life had once nearly destroyed it? Ella Rivera sat beneath a flickering lamppost at the corner of 5th and Main, her art laid out like quiet prayers on the cracked pavement. It was a weekday afternoon, the kind where people rushed by in waves, clutching lattes and dreams, rarely sparing a glance toward a girl with a buzzed scalp and weary eyes. Her table, just a piece of warped plywood balanced on old crates, held an array of hand-painted works, vivid portraits, haunting abstract pieces, and surreal landscapes that somehow all hinted at pain. At the center of the display was a simple white sign, drawn in thick black marker, "Help me beat cancer, every dollar helps." Most people looked through her, not at her. But some stopped. Some offered kind words. A few bought a piece, maybe out of pity, maybe out of real admiration. Each dollar counted. Each sale wasn't just a transaction. It was time, it was medicine, it was survival. Ella's face, though round and youthful, held a quiet gravity. Her eyes were large and amber, like they had soaked in too many sunsets too soon. She hadn't always been this girl on the street corner. Just a year ago, she was the top art student at Crestfield High, with dreams of attending Parsons in New York. Her teachers raved about her raw, emotional talent, and the way she could make a canvas weep. But then came the fatigue. Then the bruises. Then the hospital. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctors said, like it was a curse cloaked in medical jargon. The prognosis wasn't hopeless, but the costs were crushing. Ella's mother, a receptionist at a dental clinic, did what she could, but insurance only covered so much. The hospital bills ballooned. Treatments were delayed. Options shrank. So Ella picked up her brushes and took her art to the streets. She remembered her first day vividly. The fear of judgment. The cold cement under her legs. The way people avoided eye contact like her illness might be contagious. But then an older woman stopped. She was wrinkled but elegant, wearing a brooch shaped like a phoenix. She picked up a small painting of a bald girl floating in space, tethered to a heart-shaped oxygen tank. "This is you," she'd said. "But you're still breathing. That means there's hope." She paid $30, far more than Ella had asked, and walked away without taking the painting. That moment lit a fire in Ella. She returned the next day. And the next. Her pieces grew bolder, deeper, more honest. She painted what it felt like to lose her hair. What it felt like to throw up after chemo. What it felt like to lie awake at 3 a.m., wondering if the next pain meant it was getting worse. The city began to notice. A barista from the cafe across the street started bringing her hot tea every morning. A florist gave her leftover roses at closing. One local teenager even posted a video of her setup, and it went modestly viral, drawing in a few new customers. Still, the money never stretched far enough. Each chemotherapy session was thousands of dollars. Every sale was a drop in a much larger bucket. Ella learned to smile while doing math in her head, calculating how many sketches she'd need to sell just to afford her next round of treatment. But despite the exhaustion, despite the tremors in her hands and the headaches that split her skull in half, she refused to give up. Her mother begged her to rest, to let the charities handle it, but Ella couldn't stomach the idea of waiting while the cancer grew. Then came the day that would change everything. The sun was hidden behind thick grey clouds, and the air felt heavy with rain. Business was slow. People hustled past with umbrellas, barely noticing her table. Ella had just finished a piece titled The Second Opinion, a harrowing depiction of two hospital doors, one gleaming white and one cracked and blackened, like a metaphor for hope versus despair. She propped it up beside her and sat back, hugging her coat tighter. That's when she saw him. A man in dark jeans, sneakers, and a hooded sweatshirt, walking straight toward her with a kind of quiet purpose. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He stopped in front of The Second Opinion and stared, unmoving. Ella felt her chest tighten. Something about him felt familiar, though his face was partially hidden. They didn't speak. The air between them held a strange tension, like the world had stopped to breathe. Then, slowly, he pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and set it gently on the table. Without a word, he picked up the painting, nodded once, and turned away. Ella blinked, stunned. She looked at the stack of bills, heart pounding. She called out, "Wait!" But he was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. Her mother arrived shortly after, soaked from the rain and breathless from her shift. Together, they counted the money, $5,000. It didn't make sense. Why would someone, anyone, do that? Who was he? That night, Ella barely slept. Her body was drained, but her mind raced. She hadn't recognized the man, but something about the way he had looked at the painting, at her, it wasn't pity. It was something deeper. Something unsettled. The next morning, her mother shook her awake, eyes wide and phone in hand. "You're trending," she whispered. Ella sat up groggily. On the screen was a tweet, a blurry image of her sitting behind her art table. The caption read, "Saw this girl selling her soul on cardboard. Watched someone buy everything and just walk away. Humanity restored." The post had gone viral overnight. Thousands of retweets. Tens of thousands of likes. People were demanding to know who she was, where to donate. Offers came flooding in, interviews, GoFundMe campaigns, even gallery owners reaching out. Ella blinked at the screen, her voice barely a whisper. What just happened? And yet, deep inside, something told her this was only the beginning. The man in the hoodie hadn't just saved her life. He had changed its course entirely. And soon, the world would know why. Before Ella Rivera ever picked up a brush in desperation, her life had already been shaped by 1,000 quiet wounds no one else could see. She was born in a one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat, where the clatter of machines became the lullaby of her childhood. Her mother, Lucia, worked double shifts as a receptionist and sometimes cleaned houses on weekends, but still struggled to keep food on the table. Ella learned early on that joy was fragile, and security was a luxury reserved for other families. Her father had vanished before she could form a memory of him, leaving behind only an old photo strip from a mall booth and a promise scribbled on the back, "For my girls." That note, folded in a keepsake box under her mother's bed, would become the only evidence that he had ever intended to stay. Despite it all, Ella was a bright child, curious and quietly observant. Her love for drawing began with the margins of homework and grocery lists, where she'd sketched tiny scenes of fantastical animals or portraits of people who didn't know they were being watched. Her teachers noticed. They told Lucia that her daughter had talent, real talent. But art supplies were expensive, so Ella improvised. She painted with coffee on old newspapers, borrowed chalk from school, and repurposed cereal boxes as makeshift canvases. It didn't matter what she used. She had to create. Drawing gave her control when the world felt chaotic. It let her build a reality more honest than the one she lived in. At age 12, she entered her first art contest with a piece titled Silent Storm, a grayscale image of a girl screaming underwater. She didn't win, but the school counselor asked to hang it in his office. That validation meant everything. Over the next few years, she poured herself into her art, narrating her life through vivid colors and aching brushstrokes. Her style was haunting yet intimate. It spoke of loneliness but also resilience. At 15, she painted a self-portrait titled Storm with Eyes, and it won the regional youth art competition. That moment was supposed to be her launchpad. She'd started researching art schools. She had dreams of walking the halls of the Parsons School of Design, armed with nothing but a sketchbook and ambition. Then the bruises came. They started as little dots, pinpricks of purple on her arms and legs. At first, they blamed clumsiness, anemia, stress. But then came the fatigue, the nosebleeds, and the breathlessness after climbing stairs. Lucia took her to the clinic, thinking it was the flu. They were referred to a hospital, then to a specialist. The word leukemia was delivered like a thunderclap. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, to be exact. Curable, the doctor had said. Treatable. But the cost? Unimaginable. Lucia looked down at the bill and wept silently in the hallway while Ella sat on the exam table, staring at her shoelaces, unsure whether to feel terrified or numb. She hadn't even begun to live her life, and already death had begun tracing its shadow around her. The treatments began almost immediately. Chemotherapy drained her strength, dulled her senses, and burned away the last traces of normalcy. Her thick curls fell out in clumps, and the mirror became something to avoid. But even as her body betrayed her, Ella refused to let her mind decay. She began painting again, more feverishly than ever. Her pieces became darker, more raw. One day, she painted a bleeding sun eclipsed by a hollow moon, and titled it Cycle 1. Her mother cried when she saw it. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, just like Ella's life was becoming. Insurance only covered a portion of the treatment. Lucia begged for assistance, but most organizations had wait lists, forms, criteria. Time, meanwhile, was a luxury they no longer had. It was during one of those long hospital nights, when the fluorescent lights buzzed and her four beeped rhythmically, that Ella made her decision. If no one was going to save her, she would try to save herself. She returned home and gathered every piece of art she had left, unfinished canvases, sketches from childhood, even her winning self-portrait. Then she painted 3 new pieces in one sitting: diagnosis, waiting room, and the lab results. Each one was a gut punch, brutally honest depictions of what it meant to be 16 and unsure if you'd live to see 17. She didn't frame them. She didn't print flyers. She just took them to the street with a handwritten sign and a borrowed folding chair. It wasn't a gallery. It was survival. She sold her truth in brushstrokes. At first, people walked by without stopping. Her first customer was a woman who offered $5 for a sketch of a wilting flower. Ella gave it to her for free. "No," the woman said, forcing the bill into her hand. "That's not how this works." Word began to spread. Locals recognized her, and some began buying just to show support. But for every kind stranger, there were skeptics. Some accused her of exploiting her illness. One passerby muttered, "She's probably faking it for sympathy," loud enough for her to hear. Ella didn't respond. She couldn't waste energy defending her pain. She poured it into her next piece, a burning tree in the middle of a frozen lake titled Unbelieved. It sold that same afternoon. Every day was a gamble. Some days she earned enough for medicine. Other days she made barely enough for bus fare. Her mother offered to sell her wedding ring, but Ella refused. "We shouldn't have to give up everything to stay alive," she whispered. But the world didn't run on fairness. It ran on stories. And Ella's story, however painful, had begun to resonate. Her art wasn't just beautiful, it was real. It made people uncomfortable. It made them cry. It made them feel something. That connection, that invisible thread between her and a stranger moved by a brushstroke, was what kept her going. That, and the hope, however small, that someone, somewhere, would notice. And then one day, someone did. The man in the hoodie had arrived like a whisper before the storm, and Ella's quiet fight was about to become a roar the whole world would hear. The sky over Los Angeles hung low and brooding, as if it, too, bore the weight of unseen burdens. A gentle drizzle misted the air, softening the city's usual sharpness with a kind of reluctant grace. Beneath the faded green canvas of her umbrella, Ella Rivera sat with her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her pale fingers trembling as they adjusted the last of her sketches on the makeshift display table. Her latest painting, titled Every Minute Counts, still glistened with drying pigment, a surreal depiction of an hourglass with bones in the sand and a heartbeat echoing through its glass. The wind tugged at her small sign, the one that read "Help me beat cancer, every dollar helps," and she reached to flatten it for what felt like the 100th time that morning. It was a slow day. Rain scared off pedestrians, and tourists didn't linger long when the clouds threatened their photos. Across the street, the usual energy buzzed around a soundstage entrance where rumors of a celebrity shoot had drawn a modest crowd. The commotion was familiar background noise, paparazzi hoping for a shot, assistants scuttling like ants. Ella barely looked up anymore. She was used to being invisible in a world obsessed with the flashy and famous. Her world was pigment, pain, and passing minutes. She dipped her brush back into a pool of diluted black and pulled it across the cardboard canvas, trying to steady her breath. But then a shadow stretched across her table, and with it came a sudden, strange quiet. She looked up slowly, half expecting another news camera or curious onlooker. Instead, a man stood still before her, his figure partially obscured by a dark hoodie, his face tilted just low enough to remain in the shade. He didn't speak. Didn't smile. He simply looked down at the painting in the center of the table, the day after diagnosis. It was a swirling storm of reds, blacks, and splintered yellows, a chaotic representation of the emotional implosion that followed her first hospital visit. No one had ever lingered on that one. It was too raw, too harsh. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a thick, weathered envelope. Without a word, he set it gently on the corner of the table. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, he picked up the painting and began to walk away. "Wait, sir," Ella called, stumbling to her feet. But by the time she stepped past the easel, he had already melted into the drifting crowd beyond the mist. Her mother arrived just minutes later, breathless and umbrella-less, her coat soaked from sprinting the last block. Ella showed her the envelope with a stunned look. They ducked into a nearby cafe to avoid the rain and to inspect what felt too surreal to be real. Inside, they peeled open the envelope and stared at the contents in silence. 50 crisp $100 bills. $5,000. No name. No note. Just cash, heavy, anonymous, and life-changing. Lucia clutched it to her chest like it might sprout wings and fly away. "Who would do this?" she asked. "And why?" Ella didn't answer. She was still replaying the stranger's eyes in her mind, trying to find a reason, any reason, for this impossible kindness. That night, sleep eluded her. Her body begged for rest, but her mind was a kaleidoscope of questions. Was it a scam? A prank? A trap? But the next morning, the city, and soon the world, answered those questions for her. A grainy photo surfaced on Twitter. Ella at her table, her scarf fluttering in the wind, the man in the hoodie standing just a few feet away. The tweet read, "Saw this girl selling her art to pay for chemo. Dude bought the whole table without saying a word. Be like this dude." It went viral within hours. Retweets poured in by the thousands. The photo was reposted by influencers, reshared by journalists, and even commented on by blue-check celebrities. By lunchtime, her name was trending nationwide. #ArtForElla. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Strangers flooded her inbox, offering support, praise, and questions. How can we donate? Where can we buy her art? Is this girl for real? The media descended on her corner the next day. Reporters lined up with cameras and questions, their voices overlapping like waves crashing against a cliff. Ella was overwhelmed. Her mother fielded what she could, but even Lucia seemed stunned by the speed at which their lives were unraveling in public. Donations began arriving within hours. Some gave $5. Others gave $500. One man sent a note that simply read, "My sister didn't make it. I hope you do." The outpouring was surreal. But through it all, one mystery eclipsed everything else. Who was the man in the hoodie? Speculation spread like wildfire. Some believed he was an undercover philanthropist. Others guessed he was a celebrity in disguise. A few internet sleuths even swore they saw something familiar in his posture, his jawline, his hands. Rumors took off, each wilder than the last. It's a social experiment. It's for a documentary. It's a marketing stunt. But none of the guesses could be confirmed. The man had vanished into the crowd, and no one could track him. Not yet. But the internet was relentless, and Ella's face was now everywhere, from Facebook timelines to late-night talk shows. She was the girl who painted her way through cancer, whose honesty had cracked open the hardest hearts. What most people didn't see, though, was the panic beneath her surface. She didn't feel like a symbol. She felt like a girl who had run out of options. Her illness didn't care about Twitter trends. Her body still ached. Her blood count still dropped. Her life was still hanging in the balance. The fame was intoxicating and terrifying. She feared that the story had outpaced her truth. She feared being found out, even though there was nothing to hide. Her mom tried to ground her, to make it all feel manageable. But Ella had already crossed a threshold. And somewhere out there, so had the man in the hoodie. Because what Ella didn't yet know, what the world didn't yet know, was that the man who bought her entire table of artwork wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a random stranger or a nameless savior. He was someone with his own ghost to chase, and his own debt to pay. And this time, the connection between them would unravel something neither of them were ready for. Fame arrived faster than illness ever had. Within 3 days, Ella Rivera had become a household name, not through any publicist or polished campaign, but through raw honesty captured in a viral moment. Her fundraiser surged past 6 figures. Her art, once ignored on the sidewalks of downtown Los Angeles, now had collectors offering 4-digit sums for prints. Messages flooded in from strangers across the globe. Parents of cancer survivors, kids going through chemo, nurses from rural towns who had seen too much loss. They called her brave, a fighter, a hero. But along with the love came a different tide, a toxic undercurrent of doubt and envy that would slowly, ruthlessly, threaten to destroy her spirit. It began with anonymous murmurs in niche forums, where users questioned the validity of her illness. "Too pretty to be sick," one commenter wrote beneath a photo of her smiling in front of her paintings. "No 4 lines. No hospital photos. This screams scam." At first, Ella laughed it off. She thought if she didn't feed the trolls, they'd disappear. But trolls, she would soon learn, feed on silence. The skepticism snowballed. A blog post surfaced claiming Ella had been seen shopping with a friend just weeks earlier, laughing and looking completely healthy. Someone even posted a blurry image of a girl who vaguely resembled her in a cafe, claiming it as evidence that the cancer was fake. A gossip YouTuber with a massive following jumped on the story, framing it as the chemo con. Is Ella Rivera the internet's biggest fraud? The video garnered over 1 million views in 2 days. It featured misleading edits, dramatic music, and commentary dripping with suspicion. Comments flooded in. Why hasn't she posted medical records? Is her mom in on it? What kind of cancer patient has perfect eyebrows? Ella stopped checking her phone. She couldn't. Every ping felt like a punch to the gut. The girl who once used color to explain her emotions now found herself unable to paint at all. Her brushes sat dry for days. But the world didn't pause to let her catch her breath. Journalists began reaching out, not for stories of inspiration, but for investigation. Would you be willing to share hospital receipts? Do you have documentation of your diagnosis? Why hasn't the mysterious donor come forward? They weren't malicious, not all of them. But Ella felt like a suspect under interrogation. Even her supporters began asking questions, politely at first. A few donors requested refunds. Her mother, already strained from the emotional toll of watching her daughter fight for her life, now found herself wading through paperwork and online statements, desperate to defend their honor. The hospital confirmed Ella's condition, but refused to release details without proper authorization. In the time it took to navigate HIPAA regulations, the rumors had already sunk their hooks deep into the public's imagination. Every time Ella stepped outside, she felt like she was being watched. Was that woman with the stroller taking photos? Was the guy on the corner live streaming her again? The same corner that had once been a place of quiet hope now felt like a fishbowl. One afternoon, as she sat arranging her sketches, a man approached and asked, "So how much of it's real, huh?" Ella looked up, stunned. "The cancer.
Dê sob story.
You really sick or just playing the game?" Her hands trembled. She didn't respond. He chuckled and walked away, leaving a bitter silence in his wake. That night, she cried in her mother's lap like a child. "Why do they hate me?" she whispered. Lucia could only hold her tighter. "Because you reminded them of something they wanted to forget." And yet, amid the chaos, a different kind of message began to surface, quieter, but more powerful. Emails arrived from other teenagers fighting cancer, from mothers who'd lost their daughters, from nurses who'd followed Ella's story since the beginning. "You gave me hope," one girl wrote. "Because of you, I started painting again. You reminded me I'm not just a patient, I'm a person." These words anchored Ella. They reminded her that the storm wasn't just about her anymore. She was a symbol, yes, but not for fame or charity. For visibility. For defiance in the face of decay. But with that came responsibility, and a terrifying crossroads. Should she stay quiet and let the storm pass, or speak up and risk everything? Lucia was torn. On one hand, they owed no one their trauma. Ella was sick. That should have been enough. But on the other, they knew the court of public opinion didn't operate on fairness. It demanded evidence, apology, transparency, sometimes all at once. Ella made her decision late one night, curled up in bed beside a sketchpad. She drew a single eye, wide open, filled with tears and flame. Beside it, she wrote the word, witness. She posted it to her social media the next morning, along with a long message. Yes, I'm sick. Yes, I'm scared. And yes, I'm still here. You don't have to believe me. But I won't let doubt be louder than truth. The response was explosive. Her post was shared tens of thousands of times, reigniting the wave of support. The hate didn't vanish, but it quieted, overwhelmed by people rallying around her again. Artists began sharing their own witness pieces, tagging her in tributes. Cancer survivors and patients flooded her inbox with photos, letters, poems. And quietly, in the background, a new email arrived. It was from a private address, unsigned, but with a simple subject line, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Attached was a blurry photo, Ella's painting the day after diagnosis, now framed and hung above a mantel in what looked like a modest living room. It was the first trace of the man in the hoodie since his disappearance. He was still out there, still watching. And the truth, it seemed, was only beginning to unfold. The envelope had no return address, only her name written in delicate gold lettering on a thick ivory cardstock. At first, Ella thought it was another letter from a stranger, another donation, or card of encouragement. But inside was a formal invitation to an art exhibit titled Unseen Voices, a gallery event showcasing works by artists whose stories had impacted the world in ways beyond the canvas. There was no explanation, just a time, a location, and a small note scribbled at the bottom. "We've already chosen your piece. Come see it in the light it deserves." Ella hesitated. She hadn't painted in weeks, hadn't felt the fire return to her fingers since the world had turned on her. But something about the invitation pulled at her. She showed it to her mother, who raised her brows in cautious surprise. "Do you want to go?" she asked gently. Ella only nodded. Not because she was ready, but because she needed to be. The gallery sat tucked between two towering buildings in a quiet corner of downtown LA, unassuming on the outside but glowing within. Its windows were frosted, the lighting warm and deliberate. Ella wore a black dress her mother had bought on clearance 2 years earlier and covered her scalp with a soft knitted cap. She had barely the energy to climb the steps, but she pushed through the nausea and the nerves. The moment they stepped in, silence embraced them. It was a curated hush, the kind that demanded reverence. On each wall were pieces from artists she didn't recognize, but every brushstroke seemed to scream something unspoken. And then, at the far end of the room, she saw it, her painting. The day after diagnosis. It was framed, spotlighted, and placed at the center of a circular alcove like a relic. Ella froze, hand clutching her chest. Seeing it again was like confronting a ghost she'd buried. But she wasn't alone in front of it. A man stood nearby, his back to her, head slightly bowed as he stared at the painting. His hands were in his pockets. He looked familiar. Almost too familiar. And then he turned. Ella's heart stopped. It was him, the man in the hoodie. Only now he wasn't wearing a hoodie. He wore a tailored navy blue jacket, a soft shirt open at the collar, and shoes that gleamed under the gallery lights. His expression was quiet, composed, and when his eyes met hers, he gave the faintest nod. And then, as if pulled from a dream, realization struck. Michael B. Jordan. She gasped audibly. The room rippled with whispers as others began to notice. People turned. Cameras clicked. Her mother clutched her arm. But Ella couldn't move. Michael approached slowly and extended his hand. "Ella," he said, gently, "I've wanted to talk to you for a long time." The room seemed to tilt. She shook his hand out of reflex, her skin cold, her mind sprinting. "Why?" she finally whispered. He gestured toward a private lounge, and without hesitation, she followed. Inside, away from the crowd, he offered her tea. She declined. He sat across from her and exhaled slowly. "I saw you before the internet did," he began. "My team flagged your story weeks earlier. We've been working on a program to support artists, especially those fighting something bigger than themselves." Ella listened in stunned silence. "I visited you in secret," he said. "That day on the street wasn't random. I wanted to see if what I read about you was real. And when I saw you, I saw my mother." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. He told her about his mother, who had passed from cancer just a year prior. How she'd been a painter, too. How he had watched her fight with grace and defiance, until the very end. "You reminded me of her," he said. "Not because of the illness, but because you refused to let it define your art. You created through it. In spite of it. That kind of courage. It's rare." Ella blinked back tears. Her hands trembled, but she said nothing. "I didn't want the spotlight on me," he continued. "I didn't want people to think you were only important because a celebrity noticed you. I wanted you to shine on your own. And you did. But then things got dark. And I couldn't stay silent anymore." He confessed that he had arranged the gallery showing as a way to reframe her narrative. To protect her name. To show the world that her work was worthy, not because she was sick, but because it was breathtaking. Because it was true. "People listen to me," he said. "And sometimes, I wish they wouldn't. But if my voice can help people see your truth, then I want to use it the right way." Ella finally spoke. "Why me?" Her voice cracked. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because you didn't ask for anything. You just gave. Gave your story. Gave your pain. And somehow turned it into something beautiful. That deserves more than applause. That deserves protection." They sat in silence for a long time after that. And then, slowly, Ella reached into her bag and pulled out a new sketchbook. One she hadn't dared open in weeks. She placed it on the table between them and flipped to a page she had drawn the night before. A girl in shadow, holding a lantern made of her own heart, walking through a tunnel of hands, some grasping, some shielding. She hadn't known what the piece meant when she made it. But now she did. Michael looked at the drawing, then at her, and nodded. "Can I show this to the world?" he asked. She nodded once. Not because she craved the world's gaze, but because maybe, just maybe, she was ready to step out of the darkness. That night, the gallery exhibit quietly became the most talked-about art event in the city. Photos of Ella's work began circulating with the caption "Truth has a canvas." And just as quietly, Michael disappeared from the public narrative again, leaving behind no interviews or sound bites, only Ella's art, now front and center, speaking for itself. But she knew he wasn't gone. He had simply returned to the shadows where quiet kindness often lives. She never imagined that a stranger's silent purchase could lead to a truth louder than fame, and that somewhere in the grief of a Hollywood actor, her own story had found a mirror, a champion, and a second chance. The air inside the auction hall was thick with perfume, chatter, and reverence. The kind of reverence that only emerges when people feel they're witnessing something bigger than themselves. Golden light spilled from chandeliers like melted stars, reflecting off polished wine glasses and high-heeled shoes. The hall had never known a silence as profound as the one that followed the auctioneer's voice each time he uttered the name Ella Rivera. Her paintings, displayed like relics on velvet stands, glowed with painful honesty. Diagnosis went for $22,000. Witness fetched double. Each piece told a story that could not be unwritten, and each bidder seemed to know that what they were holding wasn't just art, it was a piece of someone's fight to live. Ella watched from the side, not in the spotlight, but close enough to see tears fill strangers' eyes. She stood next to her mother, both in simple dresses that spoke volumes by saying nothing. They held hands when the final bid came in, light, finally, a painting of a girl walking barefoot through a tunnel of shadows toward a blinding white sun. It sold for $75,000. The room erupted in applause. But Ella didn't smile. She closed her eyes and felt her chest rise with something deeper than pride, relief. The fundraiser exceeded expectations. Over $400,000 was raised that night, much of it earmarked for a new non-profit that Ella had quietly named Brushes of Hope. It would fund art supplies, exhibitions, and treatment support for young artists battling life-threatening illness. She had fought tooth and nail for her own survival, but now, with the weight of attention finally shifting from her shoulders to her cause, she felt something new: freedom. People came up to her throughout the night. A teacher who had lost a student. A boy with scars along his scalp who whispered that he had found courage in her colors. One man, a veteran, gave her a medal he had once received for bravery. "You deserve this more than I ever did," he said. Ella placed it gently in her mother's purse. The weight of those moments lingered longer than any spotlight ever could. She never saw Michael B. Jordan at the event. No cameras caught him. No whispers trailed him. But near the end of the night, a gallery assistant handed her an envelope with no return name. Inside was a single handwritten note: "The world heard your whisper, and now it's singing. Stay loud." She recognized the handwriting. There was no signature, but none was needed. She pressed the note to her chest and exhaled. Not everything had to be seen to be felt. That was something cancer had taught her, and something art had preserved. After the lights dimmed and the crowd thinned, she stepped outside into the cool Los Angeles air, her body weak but her spirit sharp. Her mother joined her, wrapping a coat around both their shoulders. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They walked home together through streets that now bore silent monuments to Ella's past: the sidewalk corner where she had once sat trembling, trying to sell a painting in the rain; the cafe whose owner had given her tea and warmth when she had none to spare; the alley where she'd once broken down after being accused of fraud. All those places looked different now. Not because they had changed, but because she had. When they reached their small apartment, Ella paused in the doorway and reached into her bag. She pulled out a canvas no one had seen. It wasn't part of the exhibit, and it wasn't for sale. She called it Before the Beginning. It was a portrait of a little girl standing at a window, watching her older self paint on a cracked sidewalk, rain streaking down the glass between them. She hung the piece above her bed, not because it was beautiful, it wasn't, but because it reminded her of who she had been before the world saw her. Before the diagnosis. Before the fame. Before the fear. It was the last piece she would complete before taking a break, a pause she had earned. She slept for almost 16 hours that night, her body finally surrendering to rest it had long been denied. In the days that followed, Ella remained quiet. She granted no interviews, posted no updates. The world buzzed around her, but she stayed still, rooted in recovery and reflection. But her absence didn't stop the momentum. Art schools reached out with scholarship offers. Survivors painted tributes in her honor. A mural of her now adorned a children's hospital wall in San Diego, with the words "Truth has a canvas" painted beneath her eyes. What was left unsaid would remain sacred. The details of her next treatments. The reality of remission, relapse, or reconstruction. Ella chose what the world would see from that point forward. Her voice, once amplified by chaos, became purposeful and intentional. She knew the cameras wouldn't last, that the public's attention would move on. But her art would stay. Her impact would echo. And for every girl who sat behind a table with trembling hands, wondering if anyone would care, there was now proof that the right eyes, at the right time, could change everything. She didn't paint again for 6 weeks. When she did, it was a portrait of a faceless man in a hoodie, standing beside a girl under a green umbrella. In the corner, written small but clear, were the words, "He saw me before the world did."